Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis, and we are enjoying a cup of iced Bavarian carrot cake tea, courtesy of the Rosenwein Gift Company. And we're going to talk about the social and psychological aspects of gender transition. Often, when people blog about their gender transition, they talk at length about the physical changes to their bodies, but leave out other crucial aspects like how they now have an entirely different way they must navigate in the world and society, and what impact this has on their mental landscape. I don't claim for this to be an extensive coverage of all considerations, so this is just what I've compiled so far for anyone's contemplation, and of course, as always, welcome additions and comments below. The first thing that I would like to address is the theme of symbolic death of self that occurs when someone transitions. You almost become a different person, and as such, the previous version of you ceases to exist in a lot of ways. Often, there is a name change involved. The body will go through various changes on hormone replacement therapy, and especially for trans men, there is a huge change to the face, the thing that we most identify with as ourselves. To a degree, hormones will change some of your behaviors that may cause you to question who you really are, as if watching your old self slowly disappear wasn't enough to send you into a spiral of existentialism. It's very possible, too, that while on one level you are extremely happy and excited with the changes you're undergoing, your psyche may read the death of your old self as a loss, and under the surface or in the background may trigger the Kubler-Ross cycle of grieving, which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance of the loss of the thing you enjoyed about your old life. It may be confusing on one hand to be joyful about your transition, but still experience any of that cycle of grieving and cause you to question your choices, among so many other reasons that you may be questioning your choices if you haven't done the proper therapy first before transitioning. So your mental landscape is something that needs to be carefully monitored for this potential cycle of grieving. This death and rebirth of self can also be sought after as a religious experience of sorts, which to some degree the vast majority of people need and will create for themselves in one way or another, that religious experience. It doesn't look just like joining a church. There are a lot of other iterations. Transitioning can be seen as a way to untangle a mess and start out with a fresh slate. So it's also important to be aware that this is an allure that can trigger interest in transitioning for all the wrong reasons, if you aren't the type of transgender who was born feeling as though you were in the wrong body. And while you're monitoring for this potential cycle of grief within yourself, if you have the ability also to be mindful of the people around you who care for you, keep in mind too that they will likely experience this cycle of grief. While they may be very happy for you in finally living more authentically to who you are, they still have memories and attachments to your old name, the dynamic you had with them, and perhaps may even feel some guilt if they ever behaved in a way that seemed unsupportive to who you are becoming, or they might even question your decision to transition. While you have your hands full with your own inner work on this one, if you have the capacity to also hold empathy for your close friends and family and their struggle, it may help you indirectly in the long run. The next major learning curve is realizing that there are very real differences in the way boys and girls are socialized, and the reasoning is grounded in the general trends of evolutionary biology for each sex. This is to say that overall, boys have a certain way of behaving and certain things expected of them based on deeply ingrained biological programming for species survival, because we are still animals, and girls have their own version of that too. Of course, there are atypical children like a sensitive boy or a bulldozer of a girl, and they are perfectly wonderful additions to the range of human expression. But without our conscious awareness of how we are treating them, we default to certain ways of interacting across the board. This difference in socializing for a transgender person can be a very confusing and potentially rude or dangerous awakening. And so a basic understanding of the social culture of men and the social culture of women and how those two interact would go a long way to preventing those tough lessons. I'll give a really personally embarrassing anecdote here. At one of my places of prior employment, we were having a work meeting where the majority of people who worked there were women, and at the time I hadn't yet transitioned or told anybody that I was about to either. We were getting ready to start a meeting, and one coworker arrived fashionably late, and I mean that quite literally. She was dressed for a black tie event that she had either come from or was needing to go directly to after the meeting, and she looked femininely stunning. All the eyes were on her, and some of the female coworkers piped up with, "Whoa, you look amazing." And so what did I pipe up with? A cat call. Oh God, just shoot me now. The room went quiet, and I tried desperately to melt into my seat, hoping that nobody realized that that was me. But luckily, the attention was quickly drawn away to the start of the meeting, and I didn't have to really deal with any more awkwardness other than my internal anguish. I realized in that moment that if I had been male or perceived as such, my response probably would have been met with a workplace harassment write-up. But I escaped unscathed and vowed to keep my ogling to myself at that point, and for every point forward or risk sure evisceration. It was a little sad to me to leave behind that ability for women to feel safe around me and be honest with me and me with them, but I understand why. Put analogously, the men who were entrusted to care for a harem of women in the Ottoman Empire of the ancient past were made to be eunuchs. Because if you have one, chances are you're going to use it. And this is not to inflame the hashtag not all men argument. It's just stating statistical probabilities as impersonally as possible. Of course, there are honorable men out there. Another anecdote that came up recently in this consideration of socialization was a trans man I talked to who was the recipient of a lot of misgendering harassment in the beginning of their transition in a very male-dominated profession. Understandably so, this person felt attacked and unsafe, and this makes sense, this person having grown up and been socialized in the female cultural circle. If women are going to talk badly about each other, they do it behind the target's back, a form of passive-aggressive, toxic femininity. Men, on the other hand, throw shade at each other and rag on one another as a way to vent steam and toughen each other up. Some may call this toxic masculinity, and I think it can definitely stray into that territory if the men don't realize what the practice is for and then allow that to suppress their emotions, or then try to apply that same tactic with the women in their lives. It doesn't go over well. This kind of male behavior is a deeply rooted evolutionary biology practice, a way to toughen up men to handle the horrors of a life based on just surviving and placing importance on women and children over themselves in a self-sacrificing kind of kamikaze way, something that today doesn't translate well in the world of abundance that we have. But the programming for that behavior is millions of years old, and you can't just tell it to be gone. There are many other facets to the culture of men and women, but these two I've just shared are just to get the ball rolling on the very real differences to be considered for transgender people. That being said, let's segue into the fact that there are very real differences between men and women that cause us to treat them differently on a level that is deeply buried in our genetic psyche. So while you're transitioning and inhabit a form that confuses everyday people who are used to seeing in a binary, you have to be prepared to deal with a soup of responses and awkwardness from people who cannot find a side of the fence to land on. It's even worse if you want to permanently inhabit the space in between, so to speak, the androgynous space, because the vast majority of people rely on the binary to make snap judgments in everyday scenarios, and those are coming from deep within. So reprogramming that comes with great difficulty, most of which are not going to want to bother, and also this isn't your job to do. That being said, you must have a very strong sense of self not to need other people to reflect back to you what you wish to see to validate your identity. I have a link about that above. Or else you're going to begin to feel the creep of insecurity because you failed to place the responsibility of validating identity within yourself and are leaving it at the mercy of other people. And controlling other people is like herding cats. Yet people still rage about misgendering as if they're going to be able to force someone to comply. If you truly wish to change people's minds, empathy and respect for their experience goes a long way. But at the end of the day, their choices are not yours to control. Speaking of control, there's another concept in transgenderism that I personally don't subscribe to, and that's this idea that somebody can be born in the wrong body. There's a type of transgenderism that believes this, and as far as I can tell with the science available, it's truly just a mental health disorder for someone to thoroughly believe that they were born in the wrong body. And I mean absolutely no disrespect in saying this, because while we know from neurological studies that men and women access parts of their brain differently from one another, there is no such thing as the male brain or female brain, as far as we have learned. Therefore, even if you define you as your consciousness that resides in between your ears, you/your brain cannot be born into the wrong body. Instead, it's simply a matter of disorder, which, don't get me wrong, still sucks. And since society today is really uptight about political correctness and being offended, let me disclaim that there is nothing inherently insulting about pointing out that something is not in order. That's just what a disorder is. And I'm not indicating that somehow someone is inferior with that language. Check out my video links that have flashed above as I talked about those if you want more on the ninja level mental zen of avoiding the pitfall of being offended. Anyway, if you're able, reconciling that you are not born in the wrong body and neither can you ever become the opposite sex can release you from feeling a sense of victimhood because you are taking control of the truth. Fully integrating the biological reality, which is that you are your natal sex, and the way that you choose to alter or present your body can be anywhere along the spectrum, places that seat of control within you, instead of feeling cheated by life. For me anyway, there was a tremendous peace and self-acceptance within that. Lastly, the question of am I a man or a woman ultimately seems to me to be a beside the point pondering for a transgender person. The definitions of man and woman are biological in nature, involve genitals, and are set in stone. But as humans, we are much more than this detail, which is why I feel today that the word transgender is a better term than transsexual, because to me, a transsexual is a person who involves surgically changing their dangly bits down below from what they were born with in an attempt to actually try to become the opposite sex. And this is not always true of a transgender person. And while currently people interchangeably use sex and gender, the definition of gender is more amorphous and better describes this limbo reality that people like myself inhabit. Extremely atypical for our sex, but never able to or wanting to try to be the opposite sex. The question then becomes, what gender do you feel most embodies you in terms of masculine and feminine? And then learn how to become the mentally and behaviorally healthiest versions of those to lead a fulfilling life, not chasing the physical attributes of one sex and leaving that to define you. If you plan to engage in an intimate relationship with someone, knowing yourself on this level is crucial to be able to determine what you can offer the relationship and what you will need from a relationship in order to be happiest. The biggest pitfall to avoid here is transitioning because you think it will be more desirable to someone else, whether that be for an existing partner or for a partner you wish to have. Your transition should be about what you want and only what you want, and coming from a solid place of understanding if you're to have the best shot at happiness with it. Dr. John Gray wrote a groundbreaking book decades ago called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus that shed some light on the ancient interplay between masculine and feminine that unlocked possibility for more cooperative relationships. And I would recommend the reading if for no other reason than for someone to understand which gender characteristic they have to increase their personal potential. Gender in this case is irrespective of sex, and to understand that we each have a personal cocktail of both genders may also go a long way for creating a more fruitful society. Many people will never confront all of their own emotional baggage that keeps them subcutaneously dissatisfied with life, let alone these things that I've outlined for a transgender person. But if transitioning is something you're considering, let that be a huge sign to stop and consider these points and more. It will give you an Everest-level view of the world that, while potentially isolating and a ton of work to reach, is truly beautiful from the top.